Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. I'm so glad you're joining us today. We are diving into a topic that is incredibly important for all learners, reading comprehension. And joining me today is a special guest, Dr. Emily Levy. Dr. Levy is the founder and director of EBL Coaching, a specialized tutoring program that offers individualized one-on-one home, virtual, and on-site instruction using research-based multisensory techniques. Dr. Levy is truly committed to the success of every student, and I'm so thrilled she is here with us today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Welcome to the show, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here too. I remember, when we initially jumped on the call, I was saying that during Dyslexia Awareness Month, we talked a lot about phonological processing, but we never talked about reading comprehension. And I knew that you were the perfect person to have this conversation with because a lot of the work you do and your passion is for reading comprehension. So again, thrilled to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. And of course, so many people talk about phonics, decoding, but not always reading comprehension. And reading comprehension is really the essence of reading. It's why we read, to comprehend, to learn. So it's such an important skill for all students to develop.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering if, are there common questions that you hear from parents about their children's reading difficulties that alert you to the fact that this is likely or could possibly be a reading comprehension issue?
Sure. Usually, when I speak to parents, they tend to kind of know when their child is struggling with comprehension. Usually they know when their child is struggling with reading, whether it's more decoding, kind of the mechanics of reading, more comprehension. And a lot of it is because parents find that when they read to their kids, oftentimes they can comprehend, but when they're reading on their own, then they struggle with comprehension. That's often how parents know when it's more decoding, when it's comprehension. But some kids really just struggle with reading comprehension and need the right remediation to build that skill.
Yes, absolutely. And I see that a lot. I mean, in the early years, it's pretty obvious when kids are really struggling with that phonological processing piece. But then, as kids get into the higher grades, sometimes they never had an issue with decoding. So it wasn't on anyone's radar to be concerned about reading, but then they don't like to read. They avoid reading. They kind of skim when they're reading, and parents and educators wonder why that is.
Absolutely. And there's really, as you know, a big shift from grades 3 to 4, where we shift to read, to reading, to learn, to that emphasis on reading comprehension, inferencing, drawing conclusions becomes that much greater. And that's often when kids who struggle with reading comprehension really start to hit a wall.
Right. And do we know why some students struggle? I'm sure that there are a number of different reasons, but why they struggle with reading comprehension when they do?
Well, I think there could be a variety of reasons, but I think it's a matter of brain wiring for most kids. We all have different brain structures, and some kids just really have that fundamental challenge.
Right. And we know that when they're challenged that way, it's often language based, and it impacts so much more than just reading comprehension, and impacts the ability to understand instructions and directions and a host of other things. When it comes to interventions, how do the strategies, for example, for phonological processing differ from those that you would use for reading comprehension?
Well, our approach is that we tackle each skill with a research-based technique that's best for each student, meaning we have specific strategies that we find are effective for decoding, for spelling. And then when it comes to reading comprehension, there are targeted strategies that we use for that. So, for example, one strategy that we find to be really helpful for students is a tricolored highlighting strategy, where We teach students that when we read, there's three elements we should look for. The first is the topic, which is 1, 2, or 3 words describing the passage, like the beach or World War II. And then the main idea is the second element that we look for, which is what the author is saying about the topic. The topic, I should say, we highlight in blue. The main idea we highlight in green. And then we go through and we look for the important salient details and we highlight those in yellow. And so what we're doing is we're moving from students being a passive reader, maybe not paying attention, to really becoming an active reader. And when we can actively read, that's when we start to comprehend and process the materials more. So that's one strategy that we find to be really effective for so many students.
And do the strategies differ depending on the age of the child? Because I imagine that would vary as well. And, a child who's struggling with comprehension in second grade will be different than a high school student with comprehension issues.
So that the strategies that we use are different. The material that we apply the strategies to are different as well. A lot of times when we teach a new strategy, we'll use it on a lower level passage, kind of below the child's reading level, since we're introducing a new strategy. And then as they grasp the strategy, then we'll introduce more complex content. But yes, it definitely varies based on their age and grade level.
Right. And if you think about the different ages, like what ages would you start with the intervention? Because again, some kids might be still learning to read. Do you wait until they are at that junction when they're reading to learn, where you can really focus on reading comprehension if you are aware that it's an issue for them?
Sure. So not necessarily. We will work with younger kids, but usually it's more from an auditory angle when they're younger and they're not quite reading fluently and efficiently on their own. So for example, we might work on a summarizing strategy to build auditory comprehension, where the tutor, the teacher might read a passage to the student, ask the student to retell the information that they recalled, and then kind of go back to the passage and bring in material they may have missed, and then maybe do a rewrite either by the teacher or the student. So we do find that it's important to work on comprehension strategies at a younger age if the child is struggling with that skill. But again, it tends to be more from an auditory angle with the teacher reading rather than the student reading if they don't have those skills yet.
Right. And the approach obviously differs for high school students who might be struggling with comprehension, because I imagine they are going through a lot more in-depth materials that varies across different subjects. So reading comprehension doesn't only impact, for example, language arts in the way that it would with younger students, but it impacts their understanding of science, of history, of geography, all of the other subjects as well.
Definitely. And what we find to be really effective at the high school level is to teach students a strategy, for example, the tricolor highlighting strategy, using a few isolated passages, but then we'll bring in their content from school, whether it's a social studies passage or science passage, and we'll show them how to apply that strategy to their relevant schoolwork to really help them make the connection between the new strategy and how they can apply it effectively to their own schoolwork.
And that just seems like a more practical strategy, because they can really, again, apply it in the moment to the work that they need to get done for school.
Definitely. And I think it really is important to be practical, because most high school students are already overwhelmed with the volume of schoolwork that they have. So just focus on supplemental materials, it probably will overwhelm them even more. So that's why we find it's important to make that connection to their schoolwork.
Right. And you made a point about talking about auditory input and auditory processing for younger kids when you are teaching reading and reading comprehension interventions. How much does visualization play a role in reading comprehension and in understanding what it is that we read?
Sure. That's a very important role. And that's something that we will use as a strategy as well. Some students, as you know, are able to kind of naturally form images as they read, and others are not as well. So there are strategies that we can teach them to form these visual images in their minds as they're reading, which absolutely helps with comprehension.
Right. And it's so interesting, because I had a parent say, my child can't visualize, or says that he can't visualize. So I wonder how much that plays a role, because it just seems that when you're reading, and my experience with reading is that you're forming these images in your mind of what's happening in a story. And that's why so many children and adults who read a book and then go see the movie, they're sometimes disappointed because it doesn't live up to the image that they had formed in their minds, and even how the characters looked in their minds when they created that picture.
Definitely. And that's happened to me before, by the way. All crazy images, and then the movie's nothing like that. So that does happen, but it's important to form those images, even if they're not the same as the Hollywood movie actors. Just having those images definitely helps with comprehension.
Right. And I know this will likely vary, but it's a question that parents often ask when they're thinking about seeking out an intervention to get support for their kiddo who's struggling with reading comprehension. How long does it typically take to see improvement once an intervention begins?
That is a great question. It is one that I do get often. And the real answer, of course, is every child is different. Every child moves at a different pace. But what I've found, though, is with the right methodologies in place, with the right frequency, usually within the first month, we start to see some positive changes. But then beyond that, the pace of those changes really varies on a student by student basis.
Right. And what are your thoughts about, because this is a recommendation that has come up a great deal with, providing that visual support for reading. And that can be in the form of YouTube videos on a topic. For example, the teacher is teaching, a segment on Egypt, and going to a museum and watching YouTube videos about that part of the world to enhance understanding of the information that might be in a textbook or in other materials that they're reading.
I think it's great. I think it helps kids make a connection to the content, and that will help them retain the information, remember it, and really probably enjoy the process of learning that much more as well.
And also in that same vein, when you're thinking about accommodations for kids who are struggling with reading comprehension, what are your thoughts on audiobooks versus the print versus watching the movie? And do you watch the movie and then read the book, or do you read the book and then watch the movie?
Sure. I think audiobooks are great. I think it gets kids to read even when they might otherwise not. But I think it's important that, if possible, that they follow along with the text as they're listening to really help build their reading skills. And then again, I think watching a movie can help further their comprehension of the material. So I don't see any downside. I usually find it's better to read the book or listen to the book first and then the movie. But I think all of it together really helps with comprehension.
I completely agree. And I remember finding it particularly helpful in high school when we were studying Shakespeare to watch those plays, because it really helped with understanding the language at that time.
Absolutely. Completely agree.
Is the approach for helping a child with reading comprehension different if that child also struggles with attention or who has ADHD?
I would say that most of the strategies are similar or the same. And that's because when we teach a child to be an active reader, for instance, it not only builds their comprehension skills, but it also builds their ability to stay focused and become engaged with the text. So when it comes to reading comprehension, I would say the strategies are very similar. Of course, when a child has ADHD, they often have other struggles, executive functioning and so forth, in which case we would target those skills separately. But oftentimes there's a strong overlap in the strategies with a child who has ADHD.
Right. And I think one of the things that parents will say is that their kids will start off reading, but then they'll get very distracted. And so that further interferes with their understanding of the material because they're getting distracted. They're getting off task. They're getting up to drink some water. Then they can't find their place. And then they're starting over. And then they're not really paying attention while they're reading the text. And it seems like it can exacerbate difficulties with reading comprehension when it's there.
Absolutely. Without a doubt.
And does your approach to sessions differ? For example, do you shorten the sessions? Do you break it up more often when attention is playing a role as well?
That also depends on each child's needs. Some kids have severe challenges staying focused and others less so. Some kids are okay just with the active reading strategies to help them stay focused. Others need things like breaks to take to play a little game, or breaks to watch a video, or a snack break. So we really just kind of customize every session to the needs of that particular student.
Right. And I know that parents want to be involved. They want to be helpful when their child is struggling with reading. Obviously, they want to get them support with someone like yourself or your team. But are there things that parents can do to help their children with reading comprehension at home without making it feel like another chore or homework assignment?
Sure. Well, a few things. One is when we work with students and parents are open to reinforcement, oftentimes we'll give them tools, whether it's a game or a book to read to them or a book for the child to read or whatever it may be, that they can do to reinforce what we're working on in between sessions. Beyond that, things like for younger kids, I find it so effective when parents not just read to their child, but stop and ask a lot of questions along the way. Why do you think the character did that? Why do you think she feels that way? What do you think might happen next? What happened in the story? To really engage the child and really work on those comprehension skills.
And those are really great strategies. I find that some parents will do that even with television shows. And they'll pause. Well, they don't have commercials now because people just stream everything, but pause and ask, why do you think the character was thinking that? It just helps individuals, kids particularly, get into the minds of the characters and to see things from a different perspective. And I find that enhances comprehension in general. And I can see how that would be helpful when reading books as well.
Absolutely.
And for parents who are reading with younger ones, they will often want their kids to read on their own, but is it just as effective to read to their children even when they're a little bit older?
Well, yeah, so the answer is it's still effective in terms of building comprehension skills. It's important, I think, when kids are older to also do their own reading, to work on decoding and fluency and all of those other important skills. But in terms of comprehension, absolutely, if the child's open to their parent reading to them and having discussions and talking about it, I think it's great. It might even be a newspaper article or something that happened in the news where maybe the parent reads the article out loud and then you have a discussion about it. So absolutely, I think the more exposure to language, the better.
Right. And for those kids who don't like to read, who resist reading, they will only read the books that are required for school. Are there things parents can do to encourage reading? I often think of kids who are interested in a particular subject matter, whether it be basketball or some other, thing that they're interested in, getting the materials that are related to their interests. How impactful can that be?
I was actually going to say, I think that's very impactful. That's really one of the ways we find to really help engage kids in reading. And it might even just be a little magazine article or newspaper about the topic that they're interested in to start. And then as they get used to that, then maybe we bring in longer passages than novels and so forth. But definitely starting with topics that they're really interested in is really helpful in engaging them.
And that's what I think. Every time I'm at a bookstore and I see those magazines with Taylor Swift or, whoever that NBA star is, I just think of all those kids who love those artists and love those athletes, how, again, the magazine can be very helpful in getting them started or engaging them with some of the materials.
Absolutely.
For children and teens who've had negative experiences with reading, and I've heard the story from parents and kids themselves, because the kids feel frustrated, feel defeated, how can parents and educators rebuild their confidence?
That's a tricky one. And I think there are many kids who feel defeated, especially if they've struggled in school for so long. And I think, sometimes finding books that are not just on a topic they're interested in, but maybe at a level below their reading level to start will help get them back into reading. And parents should empower their child as they progress. Look at the book that you were reading a year ago and look at where you're able to read now. And you should feel so proud of yourself and how far you've come. So I think really empowering kids with the progress that they've made and trying to just engage them in books that they're interested in and getting them more involved in reading really helps.
And I think that that's such an important piece, Emily, because I see some parents who see their kids and think that they should be reading chapter books, right? You're in fourth grade, you're in fifth grade, you should be reading chapter books, but they prefer those graphic novels. But it keeps them reading.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. If it keeps them reading, I think they should go with that. And then eventually, as they start to find more joy in reading, they will likely naturally on their own start to pick up materials that are not necessarily graphic novels, that are more densely packed with language because they feel confident in their reading abilities.
And, when I think about, again, those chapter books, and you talked about building on their reading abilities, how important is building their vocabulary and building their other language skills when it comes to supporting their understanding and reading comprehension?
It's very critical. And, it's interesting because I think as students are older in high school and they have to take these standardized tests, a lot of them are really struggling with vocabulary because they have not been reading as much all the years. And I think there's so many other opportunities for relaxation and for engagement that it's not reading in this world. So I think whatever we can do to encourage our kids to continue reading regularly and to find joy in it, it will help them on so many different levels.
Absolutely, because they're, like you're saying, there's so many things that keep them from reading that really vie for their attention. We know what social media does and all of the texts that come through and the Snapchat and all of those things. It keeps them from immersing themselves in a novel, in a book, from finishing reading that textbook rather than skimming it. So I think I completely agree with what you're saying about finding ways to engage them and to help them to love, reading.
Absolutely.
What about educators? Are there things that educators, teachers can be doing to better support students with reading comprehension in the classroom?
Sure. Well, I'm a big believer in professional development and teaching teachers practical tools that they can use within the classroom beyond what they may have learned in their undergraduate program or their teaching program, but really concrete strategies. And I think really keeping tabs on students if they're noticing a struggle with comprehension, bring it to the parents' attention, encourage them to perhaps be evaluated to see if maybe they can get additional accommodations, because the longer we wait, as we know, the more challenging it becomes for students.
Absolutely. And are there accommodations that you found particularly helpful for the students that you work with who struggle with reading comprehension?
Sometimes having things like tests read out loud to them can be really helpful. Having notes printed so that they're not trying to get down the information, comprehend the material, and do all of these steps involved in note taking. So those are some strategies that tend to be helpful with reading comprehension.
Okay. And I imagine, I always think about older kids because sometimes you mentioned assessments don't come in to get an assessment until they're much older. And a lot of these issues were not identified early on. That older student who may be reading well below grade level, are there specific approaches that will help them when they've fallen so far behind?
I think the first step is really identifying where their skills are. Are they a fifth grader at a first grade level, or are they at a fifth grader at a fourth grade level, or where are they at? And then starting with where they're at.
Where they are, right.
And then building upwards from there.
This has been really helpful because, again, I love the distinction between reading difficulties that are tied to struggles with phonological processing and reading comprehension. And like you're saying, you said at the beginning that at some point, reading is all about, getting the information and understanding it. That's where the comprehension piece comes in. We're reading to learn. And so the focus on reading comprehension is so important for every other aspect of learning.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Before we wrap up, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your work and your approach at EBL Coaching.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. At EVL Coaching, we specialize in providing one-on-one tutoring to students who have special education needs, students with dyslexia, other learning disabilities, ADHD, autism, all kinds of special education students. And we use all research-based multisensory techniques that are specifically catered to the needs of each student. We also provide the tutoring both in person in the New York, New Jersey area, and then virtually now, not just nationwide, but worldwide. We have kids all around the world. So we're really able to help kids that may not have access to these kinds of resources and this specialized tutoring instruction in their local area.
That's wonderful, Emily. And if families want to reach out to you for support, either in person if they're in your area or virtually, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
The best way is through our website, which is eblcoaching.com. E like Edward, B like boy, L like Larry, coaching.com.
Wonderful. And I will be sure to put a link to your website in the show notes because, again, I think the intervention that you provide, the support you provide is so important for so many aspects of learning for the kiddos that I work with and many other clinicians that I know work with, and also, parents who are at home and seeing their kids struggling with understanding material that is given to them. It's just so important that they're able to access that material and understand it. And that's why the intervention for reading comprehension communication is so important.
I completely agree. And thank you for that.
Thank you so much for being here, Emily. I appreciate you and all the work that you're doing. And I look forward to staying in touch.
It's been a pleasure, and I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much to all our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to share it with others who might benefit. And don't forget to join the Child Nexus email list at childnexus.com for more resources and support. Until next time, take care.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.